Welcome to the Family Milk Cow podcast, where in every episode I cover topics that equip you with the skills and know-how to look after your girls in the barn. Family milk cows are more than just livestock. They are a part of our families. They deserve the best care possible from knowledgeable and responsible owners. So pull up a chair or your milk stool and let's dive into another episode of the Family Milk Cow podcast. Hello and welcome back for another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Wolf. You may also know me from the blog and YouTube channel Rough and Tumble Farmhouse. Well, here we are, the last episode of season 2. If you're a regular podcast listener, you maybe noticed this episode's coming out a little bit later than planned. That is because of both difficulties of a technical nature and also of a time nature. We've just had so much going on, and then I had some weirdness with my computer. Doesn't matter. We're here now, and that's the important thing. Couple quick housekeeping things in terms of the podcast. So this is the end of season 2. Season 3, I was planning on starting up at the beginning of September, but honestly, that just gives me a couple of weeks of break. And it's this time of year where I'm canning. The garden is insane. Kids are headed back to school. Extracurriculars are starting. It's just a pretty insane time in September. So I will be starting up season 3, oh my gosh, which sounds crazy, in October. Now, that being said, the next season is going to be a tiny bit shorter. We're just going to do 10 episodes because if I start in October, if I were to do 12, I'd be going all the way through Christmas. And I love you guys, but I'm not hanging out here at Christmas. I'm going to be hopefully bundled up on the couch, taking a nap. I mean, that's kind of wishful thinking, but I'm going to be in hunker down mode. I'm not going to be in let's make a podcast mode. So after season 3 comes out, we will have kind of a break where hopefully I actually get my butt in gear and get season 4 all set up this winter, and then that'll come out again in the spring. So we'll have kind of a couple months break, but I will be dropping just some little shorty episodes for members of the Milkmaid Brigade, which of course, if you are a member of the Milkmaid Brigade, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. The Milkmaid Brigade is a really simple thing through Patreon where you can contribute as little as $3 a month all the way up to, I think, like 50. I don't know if you got the cash to get $50 a month, that's wonderful. But if you are like me and maybe $5 a month is kind of how much you can throw at projects you like and creators you like, that's fabulous. I have little thank yous that I'll send your way in the mail, also give you shout outs. There's all kinds of kind of fun, cool perks that I send your way just as a thank you for making this podcast happen. Definitely the funds for the podcast go right back into it. It helps pay for hosting costs. I'm hoping that I'll get enough supporters that can pay for a babysitter on occasion so I can get episodes recorded more easily. Any bit of support you send my way is so appreciated. If you can't support that way, sharing the podcast is super helpful. Liking the podcast and leaving a review, as long as it's a good review. If you have a bad review, please email me and we'll talk about it. But, do the 4 or 5-star reviews, leave some kind words behind. That helps almost as much as just supporting it financially. Okay, now one last thing before we dive into the topic today, which is a super fascinating one. And I honestly had to kind of cut myself off on the research and say, enough's enough. You've got enough. Let's just cover the topic. I really quick wanted to give one pitch to something that I just launched over on the blog and the YouTube channel called my Coop to Kitchen Cookbook. It has over 25 recipes for bountiful egg days. If you are inundated with eggs right now, I put together a cookbook that combines all my favorite recipes I've sort of gathered over the years that use a lot of eggs. Yes, there is an egg bake recipe in there, but aside from that, I tried to bring in a bunch of diverse recipes. So there's other sort of breakfast foods, there's cakes, there's sweet savories, ways to preserve them, all sorts of great ways to use up all those extra eggs. I will pop a link below where you can grab that cookbook. It is absolutely free. It's really beautiful, if I do say so myself, and I will send it straight to your email inbox, and you can just use it on your phone or computer, or you can print it off if you want to have a hard copy. Okay, now into pasteurization, which is such a long word, and I've got a lot to say on this topic, so this might be a longer episode, but we're going to just kind of dive in here with the basics, the history, why you might want to use it, why you might not want to use it. There's so much to cover. Okay, so let's just talk about what pasteurization is. Very simply, it's the process of heating a food item to kill off some of the microorganisms and bacteria so that it will have a longer shelf life. That's it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. If you are a home canner, you participate in pasteurization all the time because that is what we are doing with our canned goods. We're also, doing some other things like, removing air and stuff like that. But the big thing about when we are canning food is we heat it up to a high temperature that kills off a lot of the bacteria and makes the food shelf stable. Now, interestingly, Pasteurization is a preservation method that goes a long way back, and we all think of Louis Pasteur, but there have been a ton of people involved in this science way before he was even born, before his parents' were even born. The actual initial kind of discovery of it is credited all the way back to Japan in the year 1117, and it was documented by monks that they noticed that heating food helped it to last longer. Then in 1768, we're hopping over to Italy, where an Italian priest, he noted that food could be made sterile by being heated. Now we're kind of moving into sort of the industry part of it. In 1795, the French military offered a cash reward for people to figure out how to preserve food because obviously in the military, you need to have food you can haul around with you if possible. And so they offered this cash reward, and a guy named Nicholas Appert, I think, or Appert, I guess, Appert. I took German in high school, not French, so possibly Nicholas Appert. He is the one who kind of figured it out, and he actually sort of pioneered something then called appertization, or appertization, I guess, maybe is the way it's pronounced. I've never actually heard this word said, it's just everything I've read. And he actually started the House of Appert, which was the very first bottling factory in the world. Now, the next guy on the scene that's kind of note in terms of pasteurization is a guy named Peter Durand, also French. Instead of doing it in a bottle, he did it in a tin can. So now we're moving into sort of actually like canned preserved foods like we're kind of familiar with today. Now, Louis Pasteur, he's finally coming on the scene here since the beginning of this journey, some 700 years later. In 1864, he figured this out on a summer holiday that it was a way to help wine from losing its quality and going sour. Now, not often mentioned along with him is a guy named Robert Koch, I believe Koch, Koch. In Germany, he was doing the same thing. So, where does this come into play with milk? Well, if you're at all familiar with this, you understand that this all kind of came into play during the Industrial Revolution. So, we're in kind of like the mid 1800s into the early 1900s, was this time when there was all this big change of sort of how we were as a society. We were changing from an agrarian society kind of spread out more so in the country and in small towns into these really kind of conglomerated, real close together urban environments because of all the manufacturing that was starting to happen at an insanely fast rate. Now, with this big change, we also had a huge decline in breastfeeding because mothers now that were in the cities, in order for people to make ends meet, the moms, they were going off and working in these manufacturing jobs as well. And so 50 to 70% of moms transition from being just home with their kids to working in some sort of factory, most likely. Now, with all these people concentrated in cities, you still have to feed these people. But instead of kind of having small local family run dairies, they were making the transition into big, large mass dairies. Some of the biggest dairies that they have on record, this is in the mid 1800s, just outside of large cities, were 2,000 cows, which I can't wrap my head around the concept of 2,000 cows. Even today, which is even a small number for some dairies. Never mind, imagine in the mid 1800s with sort of the hygiene and science understanding back then, trying to get good milk from that many cows really close to the city is just not really a good option. All these cows that are really in close to the city or sometimes even in cities were largely fed distillers grains, and they were fed, I was reading in an article I'll tell you about in a second here, I believe it was 30 pounds of distillers grains and only 3 pounds of hay. These poor animals were so sick and so just mistreated. There's records of animals just having huge mouth ulcers. Their tails were falling off. The milk that came out of them was blue and it stank. Like just awful situation for these poor animals. And then, of course, for the people who are supposed to be drinking this stuff. And largely, a lot of the people who drink milk is, of course, kids and babies because these moms aren't home anymore that they can feed their babies. They don't have another option. So they're feeding them this awful milk, which, too, of course, disgustingly, this milk was such an awful quality. They would mix in like chalk and plaster of Paris and sawdust and all kinds of nasty stuff into the milk to try and make it look less gross, I guess. I can't imagine it would smell any better having sawdusty milk. I don't know. But it was to the point where the infant mortality rate in Europe and the United States was pretty horrible. So today, the infant mortality rate is between 5 to 6 in every 1,000 births. And then at that time, it was 150 up to about 360 babies out of 1,000 would not survive infancy. The milk just had all sorts of awful stuff. People were getting tuberculosis, brucellosis, different types of strep, diphtheria, salmonella, all kinds of stuff. It was horrible. You might be wondering too, well, what about bringing milk into the cities? This really wasn't an option because we didn't have good refrigeration options back then. Things were traveling by horse a lot still at the time. By the time milk would actually get from farms that were further out where the animals had a decent quality of life, it just wasn't good anymore. It had been spoiled or sloshed around and curdled. It just was no longer good to drink. Even if that milk started out being of a good quality, by the time it made that trip into the cities, it was milk that was going to make you and your kids potentially very sick. The big change actually came in 1870 in Denmark. A professor, N.J. Fjord, pasteurized milk for the first time, at least that we have on record. And in Germany in 1882, it began being bottled. Of course, this was huge. Now we had milk that is incredibly nutritious for the most part, that is now safe to drink, that began going out to families and into the cities. So it was huge. And obviously the circumstances shouldn't have been what they were for those animals. And the Industrial Revolution was horrible for so many people. When you read about it, it was a great time in terms of innovation, but that innovation came at an insane cost to a lot of families, which is really, really unfortunate. Now that brings us to today. We still have and use pasteurization because, for the most part, most milk that people are going to be drinking is coming from large cow dairies. It is traveling long distances. And frankly, the way to keep the milk safe in the systems that we have that are feeding the majority of people is via pasteurization. And I feel like pasteurization is one of those things where people get kind of chippy about it, or, just kind of, I don't know, weird about it. And in terms of raw milk in general, you have people on one side that say, if you drink raw milk, you're an idiot. You have people who drink raw milk and say, if you don't drink raw milk or get it, you're an idiot. And frankly, like most things, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Just one county away from us, there's sort of a mega dairy that is trying to get set up down there, and they will have 12,000 cows in confinement. And I did not say that wrong. 12,000 cows. And I know I come from a very small dairy background. The dairy farm I worked at for a summer, it was a grass-based diversified dairy. We were milking 8 cows. The biggest dairy farm I've ever helped out at was 35 cows. So I kind of come from a very small dairy sort of thinking and background. And I know not everybody does, which is fine. And I think you can have healthy animals on pasture in much larger numbers if you've got the way to set up to take care of them. But I cannot, for the life of me, wrap my head around 12,000 cows stuck in a barn for their entire lives. I don't like it. I don't care for it. And so, even though I confidently drink raw milk most of the time, we'll get into that, from my own animals or from, other trusted sources, you couldn't pay me to go and put my cup under the spigot of a 12,000 cow milk dairy. I wouldn't do it. So there's a lot to be said about the quality of raw milk and understanding where it is coming from and it being safe versus the reality of the systems we currently have, which hopefully change and are changing in a lot of ways. The reality of the system we currently have to efficiently and effectively get milk to as many people who need milk for drinking. Pasteurization is the safest way to do so, in my opinion. Would I prefer that everybody had a nice, trusted, reliable dairy nearby where they could go and get raw milk anytime they wanted? Absolutely. That is the dream. But until we have kind of a different food system, until it looks a lot different, I just don't think it's something that's going to be in the near future, unfortunately. Down the road, though, hopefully. Let's talk a little bit about nutritional quality when it comes to pasteurization. So that's one of the big things that comes up is, are we losing nutritional value when we pasteurize milk? What the science says on this is a little bit, somewhat. And that's, losing nutritional value is different than talking about change of protein structure, which absolutely happens. There's a protein structure change in there. It's different than talking about homogenization, which absolutely is changing the structure of our milk. That has other effects on it. But talking just straight nutritional changes, it has a small effect on kind of degrading B vitamins, though it is still a good source of B vitamins. And aside from that, it's not affecting the nutrition all that much, especially if you aren't ultra pasteurizing it. The higher heat you're pasteurizing it at, then the more you're going to be degrading some of those nutrients. Now, how do we pasteurize? How is that process done? So there's a couple different levels of pasteurization and how it's done. So we're going to start with vat pasteurization. This is the kind when I have pasteurized milk that I use, where you heat the milk to 145 Fahrenheit or 63 Celsius and maintain it at that temperature. It can't dip below it for 30 minutes. This is my preferred method, again, because you really aren't changing like structures of things too much. It is getting warm and you're affecting it somewhat, but this is kind of the bare minimum you can do to pasteurize your milk. After that, we have high temperature short time, or HTST, and then you're heating to 161 Fahrenheit or 72 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. I'll be honest, if I'm in a rush and I'm pasteurizing milk for some reason, that's what I'm doing. The next one is a higher heat, shorter time, HHST. That's 191 degrees to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and you need to do it for 1 second. Then we have ultra pasteurization, which is 280 degrees Fahrenheit or 138 Celsius for 2 seconds. In the United States, the one that you're most likely going to see is the high temperature short time, which means that it was heated to 161 degrees Fahrenheit. If you do choose to pasteurize your milk for some reason, then the way you do it very simply is you put it in a nice stainless steel pot. You want to heat it up to whichever temperature you want to do again. And then once it has reached its proper temperature and the proper amount of time, then you want to cool it down quickly. So what I like to do is I will put like an ice bath in my sink to drop the temperature really quickly, just like when you're handling raw milk in general. And then once it has cooled down enough, then I will stick it in the fridge right away. Now, should you or shouldn't you pasteurize your milk? That is absolutely a personal choice and about your comfort level. I have gone through stretches where I pasteurized my milk before, even though I've also been a raw milk drinker for a very long time. Last summer during milking, so let's see, my son was just, gosh, like 5 months old, 6 months old. And at that time, for whatever reason, I was getting little round blops of like gray mold type stuff growing in the middle of my milk that was not very old, and I could not figure out for the life of me what was causing this. I have milked cows for years. I have washed my jars the same way and sanitized things the same way. Could not figure out why I was getting this mold in the jars, and it was freaking me out. And again, my son was 6 months. I was postpartum, so I was having some kind of postpartum depression and anxiety stuff. And the last thing I needed was to be worried that I was poisoning my family with our raw milk. So what I did is I just pasteurized it. When I brought it in, I'd put it through the filter right into my stainless steel pot and I would pasteurize it. If it was something I was going to use for making cheese, then I wouldn't pasteurize it. I would just filter it, put it in the fridge, and then save it for later for cheese making. But for our family's drinking milk for last year, I pasteurized it all and I had no problem with that. This is one of those things where nobody can or should tell you what is the right choice for you and your family. If you want to go and squirt milk straight from the teat into your coffee, that's fantastic. If you want to bring the milk in and pasteurize it for drinking, that's fantastic too. Nobody should make you feel bad. Either way, you know what's best for you and for yours. Okay, I'm gonna get off that little soapbox for a second here. I just get my hackles get up a little bit when people are one way or the other. Oh, you need to do this or you need to do that. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe there's another answer here. Maybe you should just mind your own business for heaven's sake. Anyway, one last thing to talk about is using raw milk or pasteurized milk in recipes and things like that. So if you are making cheese, unless it is a specifically raw milk cheese or it's one where you don't have to heat it to a certain amount or you're not adding a specific culture, a lot of cheese recipes, you are going to be pasteurizing your milk because you need that milk to be heated up enough that it's killing off other bacterias and cultures so you can introduce the culture you want. Because otherwise, the culture you put in has to compete with the other culture that's already in there, and you might end up with a funky tasting cheese. In terms of making kefir and yogurt and other stuff, I've used both milk that I pasteurize, I've used store-bought milk, I've used raw milk. For the most part, it all kind of reacts just about the same. At least that's in my experience, but I do know in a lot of cheese making books that I have read through, they will recommend that you use raw milk because it just tends to work better. Okay, so I think I covered the topic fairly well. Oh, I did want to tell you, let me look here at what that article was that I read that was so good, if I can find it here. Okay, yes, it is called A Brief History of Milk Hygiene and Its Impact on Infant Mortality from 1875 to 1925 and Implications for Today, a review. That's a long one. But it is a super fascinating article, and it's one where I was reading it and taking notes, and I finally had to say, stop. This is too much information. Just tell the people about it. They can read about it themselves. So check that out. I will link it below in the description box or show notes or whatever down below so you can check it out yourself if you'd like. Thank you guys so much for supporting me here on the podcast for season 2, and I really hope I will see you here again for season 3. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Family Milk Cow Podcast. You can become a part of the Family Milk Cow Podcast by joining the Milkmaid Brigade, sponsoring an episode, or following along on social media. You can find links for all these and more, including show notes, at familymilkcowpodcast.com. If you love what you're hearing, please rate, review, subscribe, and turn on those automatic downloads. One of the best ways to support this show is simply by sharing it. And as always, make sure to give your girl down in the barn a good scratch behind the ears from me.